Well, Chapter 18, Performance and Discharge. And this is getting close to the end of our largest grouping of chapters. And that's all having to do with the basic rules of contract. So let's go ahead and jump in. We just have a little bit more in these, and then we'll be able to kind of do some refinement of them, where we'll look at some of the UCC, and then we'll have a real kind of radical jump where we'll move to employment law. Okay, so one of the things that occurs in contracts is you'll hear the term conditions. So conditions, typically when it's being used for contract, refer to a possible future event. And very often condition is a modifier, or is modified rather, something that will occur in the future, something that has occurred in the past, but typically the occurrence of this condition or its absence will trigger or won't trigger an end to an obligation under a contract. Now, for example, in a life insurance policy, a condition, this would be a future condition, the death of the person who's paying for the life insurance policy, triggers an obligation on the part of the insurance company to go ahead and pay the outstanding amount. You also, in this area, will typically hear the term tender. Sometimes you'll hear it as perfect tender, tender of performance, but tender is an unconditional promise to perform from someone who is ready, willing, and able to perform. Now, sometimes tender is offered and the other party refuses. This can be important because that refusal of tender or perfect tender can constitute a breach of the contract. Now, like I said, often condition is modified. It can be modified as a condition precedent or a condition subsequent. So a condition precedent is an act that must occur or be completed before a duty to perform arises under the contract. So if you have two parties in a contract, very often the condition precedent is something that happens that triggers the other person to perform tender. So an example here would be if you go to buy a house, you all are typically aware that you will sign a contract and offer to purchase, and there is very often a condition in that contract, and that condition says that you have to be able to obtain financing, and usually people will write in a rate of no greater than X, the prime plus 3 or something, and or that an appraisal has to come back. But basically it's a condition before you have to complete the sale, before you have to go forward. A condition subsequent typically is something that ends a duty to perform. Sometimes what it does is it ends a contract. You might have a condition in a new hire that says, okay, we're going to hire you for the company on the condition subsequent that you pass a drug test or a background check. And when you don't, then the necessity to perform ends. Express conditions. Express conditions are a lot like every other term express. Express means they're usually provided for directly in a contract, typically with utilization of specific words. Very often these are if, or provided, or after, or when, and then a description of whatever the condition is. Implied in fact, of course, some things are just, we don't have to spell out every single thing. So we might have a warranty that exists for an item that's sold. So what's one of the conditions to repair a broken item? Well, that you let me know that it's broken. So the warranty can't be triggered until the condition that the item is broken. And you have to let me know that it's broken if I'm the person that's offering a warranty. I don't have to say that in the contract. Some people do a lot of additional drafting, and that's where contracts can get very, very, very long, where they're going to attempt to really cover every single potential condition that could occur or should occur. I generally find that type of drafting of contract excessive, and inevitably if you have so much, you're going to forget something still. And the question becomes, well, you don't have any general language in there because you omitted it, so you could put all these specific language in there. So your implied and fact conditions may not arise. So it can be a two-edged sword to go too far down the idea of putting express condition after express condition in and not allowing more implied conditions. Okay, the next term is discharge. Now, most contracts, if you think about them, most contracts, everybody does what they're supposed to do. You promise to paint my house, I promise to pay you. You paint my house, I pay you. You promise to sell me your car, you sell me your car, I give you the money. So each side gives tender. So almost all contracts are discharged by performance, and performance is accomplished by offering tender. Now, it can be actual tender doing it, or it can be the offer of tender. Yes, I'm right here to do it. Can I do it? And then the other party might refuse, in which case the breach is not on the person's part who's offered tender, but on the person that refused tender or performance. So there can be different types of performance worth mentioning here. And this is a little bit of a state of an art argument, but let's look at it. There is complete performance. Now, complete performance, sometimes you hear the term perfect performance. Complete performance means that exactly what was called for in the contract was tendered, was given. So you promised to sell me a 1964 Chevy with, the specific engine model and the specific accoutrements on the car, and that's exactly what you sell me. And I promise to pay you $5,395, and I give you $5,395. That's complete performance. Now, that's ideal because everybody has met all the conditions of the contract, and now essentially the contract has gone, if we refer back to some of the early chapters, from being an executory contract, one that's not yet complete, to an executed contract. However, sometimes we do have substantial performance. Now, this raises the term good faith. I think this might be the first time in this unit that we begin to talk about good faith. But good faith is a very important concept. It's also extremely important when we look at the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code, because we're going to assume that everybody acts in good faith. You shouldn't be trying to cheat the other person. You really should be trying to go through with the contract, to act honest in fact and honest in deed. You shouldn't try to find loopholes. You really should be working for the contract. So substantial performance means you act in good faith and you do most, I would say almost all of what is called for. Particularly that you meet everything that is important and everything that is essential. So let's go back to I offer to sell you a year 2020 Mercedes-Benz. Okay, so we have a price agreed upon, we have a make, we have a model, we have a color, we have an engine, and I deliver all of that. There is one difference. There are 4 floor mats in the Mercedes, the 2 front and the 2 back, and one of the back ones is missing, or is of a slightly different design. It doesn't match. Well, I've really met substantial performance. At this point, it's not perfect performance, but I've met substantial performance. Any shortfall here, let's suppose I didn't notice, it's just a slightly different mat and I didn't do it on purpose. Essentially what we're going to find under substantial performance is, all right, I delivered you to this car. It's 99.999% of what you asked for. There's this one small difference. Yes, maybe you are entitled to do some damages. What is the total possible value of 4 floor mats if we had to get 4 new floor mats from Mercedes? That should be your damages. But you're going to have to pay me for the car. So I'm going to deliver the car to you. You can't say, well, I absolutely reject this because I've met substantial performance. Now, sometimes a contract doesn't use terminology or isn't guided really by the concept of substantial performance, but rather it's guided by words like this contract must be performed completely to the satisfaction of the buyer. That you must be 100% happy with the car. Well, that would be different, because what you're doing there is you're saying one of the two parties in privity really must approve. Now, for the sale of a good, that's going to be very hard to enforce if someone's delivering 99.95. Most of the time, satisfaction of one party would be some sort of personal contract, something very, very personal in performance, where it would be a little hard to judge except by asking, did this meet your expectations? So this could be an example like this. Will you paint my portrait and make me look really good in it, and I'm going to hire you for it to my satisfaction? And you paint not a very good portrait, or maybe it's an adequate portrait, or it's pretty good. Well, a court might say, well, you might have, if we had just gone from a completely neutral point of view, this might be substantial performance, but your contract really called for the satisfaction of one party. Now, if one party's being unreasonable here, you can get yourself in trouble, because remember, good faith, honesty in fact, honesty in deed, underlies the contract. And if one party here is just being just an absolute jerk about it, then the court might say, well, you haven't met the standard of a reasonable man, so we're going to say that you're really being dishonest here. A third alternative, or maybe a fourth if we don't include complete, if we do include complete performance, would be performance to satisfaction of a third party. Sometimes you say, okay, if there is a dispute, or if we need to make a judgment about completion, we're going to leave it up to this neutral third party. Now, this is not necessarily bringing in a formal arbiter, but it could be something like that. So it could say, okay, if there is a dispute, this third party will judge if there was satisfaction. Sometimes, of course, people don't fix or don't deliver what's called for in a contract. So let's suppose that our contract, going back, was for the 2020 Mercedes, and there is a breach of the contract. You don't deliver a 2020 Mercedes. You deliver me a 2019 Mercedes. And what you've done there is you have breached the contract. It is non-performance of a material part of the contract. Remember, material here means a critical or important part. It's not the one floor mat in the back. It must substantially affect the contract to be material. So clearly the make and the model number of a car, if it's being sold, would be material. If it is a non-material breach, so let's go back to our substantial performance. If it was, I delivered 3 matching floor mats and the 4th one was damaged or omitted or something. Well, you actually, under contract, typically must give me time to cure. And cure means that you have time to fix any outstanding problem. Now, this assumes that time was not of the essence here. So let's suppose I tell you, look, I'm driving to California, and I need a reliable van, and I'm going to buy a van from you, but I have to have it in my hands by Monday morning at 8 because I'm leaving Monday afternoon. So I come to your point of sale. It's 8 o'clock. It's not there. Well, that would be a material breach. It wouldn't be a non-material breach. You wouldn't necessarily have time to cure. I could go out and rent another van and sue you for damages. But if I said, well, look, I'm going to be leaving on Friday, and I deliver a van on Monday that, let's suppose, has an alignment issue or something relatively minor, you've got to give me time to fix it if you're not leaving that afternoon, if time is not critical in the performance. All right, now I'm going to introduce a term that is a little strange. It's called anticipatory repudiation. This happens sometimes when the contract is to be performed, and you tell the person, even though maybe your time per performance hasn't arisen yet, that you won't be doing it. So let me give you an example. A few years ago, Kim Basinger was a extremely hot actress, and I mean popular actress. She was, I don't mean her physical attributes. Kim Basinger was a very hot actress in Hollywood. She was much in demand. And before she really had gotten to this point, she had signed a contract to perform in a movie that was not terribly good. But this was before she became quite famous. So she becomes famous, and now it's getting close to the time that she is going to have to come and do this movie. And the movie was it was called Boxing Helena, as I recall. And to give you an idea how bad this movie was, it takes the place of a surgeon who amputates the limbs of his girlfriend and keeps her in a box in the closet. I've never seen the movie. I've only read the blog about it. But obviously, she had just come off of some major accomplishments. She was a big star. She's very hot. She'd signed this before. Now she didn't want to do it. So what she told the people was, I know I'm supposed to come down there, and let's suppose it's December. I'm supposed to come down there in April in 3 months and start shooting this movie. I'm not coming. I am breaching this contract. When you say, I'm not going to perform, when she said that, she had anticipated the contract and repudiated the contract, so we call it anticipatory repudiation. Now, the makers of the film had a lot of options. The first thing they could do was they could just flat out immediately sue her. Say, okay, well, we're not going to be able to make this film. We're going to shut down production, look at all our losses, and sue you. Or we could wait for April and sue you then. And what they actually did was pretty interesting. They actually filmed the movie with another actress, released it. It didn't do well, duh. And they sued, claiming this is what we would have made. I guess they could establish that in court. Versus if you had started a movie because you were so famous, and this is what we made because we had this actress. And I want to say the actress is Julianne Moore, but I wouldn't swear to it. This is what we made because of it. And that was interesting because they actually won their case, and they, as I recall, they actually bankrupted her. She actually wound up having to declare bankruptcy because they won several $1 million from her. Okay, time of performance. If we don't state in the contract that time is vital, if we don't give a deadline and say this is a critical deadline, then you have a reasonable time to complete the contract, and time is not deemed to be material or vital. We can also have discharge by agreement. Sometimes two people are in a contract, and each party decides, it's better if we get out of this. You're not happy in the contract. I don't want to keep you in the contract if you're not happy. So let's agree to you walk away and maybe you pay me this much. And that's what Kim Basinger, if we go back to that, I think was hoping for. She was going to say, okay, this might cost me a couple $100,000 or something, but I can make millions if I do other movies. So I want to do that, as opposed to starring in this weird movie that I had signed up for originally. So she was hoping for an agreement to discharge by agreement, didn't get it. Discharge by rescission is another option, and this is where not just one wants out, but both want out, and they both back. And basically, they can make a separate contract. They can have an offer and acceptance and consideration. And in some cases, it can just be no harm, no foul. We're walking away with nothing. Usually, if it's executory on both sides, you don't need new consideration besides you're not going to do what you required to. But if one party's done something, if one party's completed it, then we're back to that old example I gave you about the clipper ships where these sailors would get to Canton, China and demand more money. really, if one party's executed the contract, you're going to have to give the other party something for the rescission, or it's going to look like undue influence, really. Now, this was that term, novation, that I wish had been in an earlier contract. Remember, we talked about a little bit about assignments and delegations. And I said, well, if you delegate a duty, if you recall this from the previous chapter, if you delegate a duty, you're still responsible if the guy you delegate the duty to does a bad job. Well, maybe you can avoid that, because don't do a delegation, do what is properly called a novation, novos being Latin for new contract. So a novation is a complete substitution of one of the parties in contract by another and a release of the first party. So I'm supposed to paint your house, and you're supposed to pay me $5,000, and I fall off a ladder before my time performance is called for, and I break my leg. And I come up to you and I say, look, I can't paint your house. Now, I know John, and he's a good guy. He'll paint your house, same price, but I can't be responsible for him. Now, if you want to wait, I'll be off my crutches in a few weeks. Great, we'll do it then, but I can't do it now. What I'd like to do is sign a novation. You substitute John for me. I walk away. If John messes up, that's between you and him. If you don't pay him, that's between you and him. I don't want to be involved anymore. So what you have is you have a previous obligation. You have an agreement by all three of the parties, the original two parties in privity, the buyer, the seller, promisor or promisee, and the new person you're bringing in. You can have agreement by settlement and discharge, where you can have a genuine dispute as to what is owed, and we can have a new agreement come in to replace the old agreement. Sometimes accord and satisfaction is used here, but this is a discharge by settlement agreement. And this happens somewhat often. So accord and satisfaction is a term I just used, and this is basically, there's performance called for in the contract, and there is a dispute. Now, there has to be a dispute. If it's just one party holding up the other party with no cause, no reason, no benefit, well, then accord and satisfaction is much more difficult to get to work. It's really a subcategory, accord and satisfaction, of compromise. The accord is your contract. The satisfaction is the new consideration or the revised. So let's suppose I performed for you. Maybe I made complete but not perfect performance. Certainly substantial performance, okay? Maybe I did 95% of what was called for. You have a few issues. I claim that, well, it's good enough, you should pay me 90% of the money you owe me. Suppose it's $1,000. You should pay me $900. And you say, no, I shouldn't. I should only pay you $500. So there's $400 in dispute there. So we talk about it, we say, okay, I tell you what, let's just come to an agreement. I'll take $800. And you say, that's fair. So there's an uncertain amount of money here owed. We agree to the new consideration. This is it. We'll settle it. We sign a contract. You pay. We're done. That's accord and satisfaction. We also can have discharge by operational law. There's going to be certain circumstances where the law is going to come in and say, okay, this contract's done. So there's alteration, statute of limitations, bankruptcy, and impossibility. Let's look at them. One of the things lawyers will do when I draft the contract and I get each party to sign it is I keep a photostatic copy of the signed contract. Now, why do I do this? Because, believe it or not, it's not unknown for someone to take the contract home, change it, erase it, alter it, and then present it and say, nope, this is what we signed. So, the neutral party here would be me, because I would have a notarized copy of it. You would have the altered copy of it. So if one party tries to alter a contract, arrange it, typically the other party, if they want, are discharged. It creates a voidable contract. The other way a contract can be voided is after a number of years. If you signed a contract 40 years ago for something, it's not enforceable. And this is going to depend upon, is it a labor contract? Is it a contract for the sale of goods? I mean, there's a bunch of limitations. But the general rule here is that typically 4 years is your maximum to sue. If you don't sue and try to recover discharge within 4 years, you can't.
The third one here is bankruptcy. Now, we've actually, in business law too, if some of you are going to take that, we'll cover bankruptcy. But this is a vitally important one. And sometimes bankruptcy is a tool of business. So if you have a contract with someone and say, okay, I'm going to declare bankruptcy, the other party might panic and say, oh, don't do that. I'd rather work with you than have you declare bankruptcy, because once that person declares bankruptcy, that's going to really set up a new order of who gets paid from whatever money is left. And all of a sudden, a creditor who might have been getting $100,000 might get nothing. So bankruptcy really will discharge people in contract and really brings you into a court setting where the trustee in bankruptcy will say, okay, this is what the law says, this is what you're going to get and when you're going to get it, if you get anything. Impossibility is one of the last things we'll talk about here, but impossibilities can be defined either as objectively impossible, it can't be done, or subjectively impossible, I can't do it. Each of these can end a contract. Now, what are ones that obviously will end it? One, the death of somebody in privity. You're going to sell me a car, I'm going to buy a car, I die. My estate does not have to buy that car. If the subject matter is destroyed, you're going to sell me this car, I've got the car, there's a fire at my lot, it burns down, I can't sell it to you, contract ends. If there's a change in law that renders performance illegal. So let's suppose, I was talking to someone about Sudafed and Actifed the other day about how they were the basis of methamphetamines. So let's suppose I had a deal as a small drugstore where I would buy Sudafed, I would buy X amount of Sudafed from a distributor. And the state of North Carolina says, well, we're going to limit the amount of Sudafed that could be sold. We're going to say only this much can be sold this often. And there are legal limits on the sale of Sudafed, Actifed right now because it is the basis of meth. So I'm sure there were contracts for the sale of Sudafed and Actifed, and when the law in North Carolina went into effect that said you can only sell it this amount in this way, that affected people's contracts. But if the law comes in and changes it, then the law supersedes our agreement, and impossibility becomes a defense. Now, there can be temporary impossibility. This can be something that can suspend performance. And there's an interesting case here, and you can look at this case. I hope it's still in your text. It's called Autry versus Republic Pictures or Republic Productions. This is a case of Gene Autry, who was an actor, and he had a contract with Republic Pictures, and he was drafted. He went into the Army. Because he was in the Army, essentially what the court said is, it is impossible for him to perform under the contract, so you can't sue him right now, get the money for him. But when he is discharged from the Army, he has an obligation to complete the contract. By the way, this happened, and this is a bit of a surprise, but if you follow baseball, during the Korean War, and during World War II as well, many baseball players were drafted into the Army or the Air Force and the Navy, or the Air Corps during the Second World War. And, for those 3 or 4 years, okay, they were in limbo. They didn't have to play for the New York Yankees anymore, but when they got out, they still had a contract with the New York Yankees. When they got out in 1945, or if it was Korea in 1953, they had to come back out. Probably the most famous one you could Google if you wanted pictures of is Elvis Presley was drafted into the Army at the height of his popularity, just about. And he served in Germany. And of course, he had a contract, I'm sure, for the production of records for different companies. But it was temporarily impossible for him to do that. The result was, of course, that after he got out of the Army, he went back into the contract. So only after this temporary impossibility ends do you have to perform. But if it never ends, you never have to perform, obviously. There's also commercial impracticality, or practicability. This is when performance becomes prohibitively costly to carry out. Now, I was thinking about this, and I think COVID-19 gives us a good example. Let's suppose that I had a contract with you that said I would deliver 600 gross of toilet paper to your supermarket every week. And all of a sudden, you cannot get toilet paper. You cannot get napkins. You can't get any of this stuff. And the cost of it just skyrockets. So the cost becomes prohibitively expensive. Now, commercial practicability only applies if something happens outside that should not be able to be anticipated by either side, like a pandemic, a blockade, an act of God, or war. This will basically suspend the necessity of performance. It'll let you out of the contract. But if it's just something minor like, well, my truck broke down and it's going to be expensive for me to hire a new truck to deliver the toilet paper, well, too bad, hire the truck. But if it's a COVID epidemic and I can't get the raw material to make the toilet paper, different story, you'd have that as a defense. We also have something close to this called frustration of purpose, where if the underlying purpose of the contract is no longer possible, then the contract dies. But the event should be reasonably unforeseeable. This is close to it, but it's a good way to think of it, the burning of a house. So I hire you to paint my house, the house burns down, or there's a flood, and the house has to be abandoned because it's rot. Okay, there's a once-in-a-century flood. The house you were going to paint for me that I was going to live in gets flooded and rendered uninhabitable. Well, that's an unforeseeable event. Therefore, frustration of purpose might discharge. Okay, that keeps it right at half an hour or so. Whenever you're ready, click on the next chapter, and I'll talk to you then.